Hello and welcome to the Business of Possibility podcast with Ulster University Business School. I'm Wendy Austin, and in these series we've been diving deep into business in Northern Ireland. Now, it's no secret that small to medium-sized businesses form the backbone of the Northern Ireland economy, with family-run enterprises making up 74% of businesses across the region and contributing significantly to employment opportunities and the welfare of local communities. They've been at the heart of this last difficult year. So how have they fared, adapted, innovated, pivoted, and how are they going to come out of this? Well, let's find out. With me today, Ian Smyth, lecturer in Human Resource Management at Ulster University Business School, Darren McDowell, who's senior partner at Harbinson, Mulholland, and Paul Black, chief executive at family firm Alpha Marketing. It's great to have you all with us today. Now, there's been some kind of disruption, good or bad, for virtually every business this year. The Family Business Survival Survey has been measuring just how it's been hitting this very important group. So Darren, maybe you could tell us a bit about the survey and about some of the key concerns that it showed were facing business owners.
Thank you, Wendy. Yes, this survey was conducted by the DCU National Centre for Family Business along with Ulster University, and also interesting, the University of Central Florida, which is an indication, I think, of the impact that COVID is having. You can have these connections. We've had lots of Zoom calls with Florida, which has been great, Ian, and we really do need to visit. But to this survey, Harbinson Mulholland are also actively involved with the Northern Ireland Family Business Forum, and this survey looked at the impact of COVID-19, both from the perspective of the last year, but also to the future, and looking at any possible lessons that can be learned from the period that we have all worked through. So the survey was conducted for family businesses across the island of Ireland. There were 50 plus CEOs who were surveyed and over 200 of their employees. And to answer your question, Wendy, the concerns that came out of that, I suppose, are unsurprising in some senses, in that the key concerns were around loss of revenue and cash flow and what that would mean in these uncertain times. But I think the other thing to say is that there were 8 core themes extracted from the survey, some of which we'll touch upon, I'm sure, looking at things such as benevolent leadership, communication and resilience. And all of these, I think, are good as we head into this still uncertain time.
Yes, there were some really interesting elements, I think, that we can pull out of it indeed. And Paul, you've been very much at the coalface during all of this. Can you talk us through maybe some of the milestones at that time, right from the start? I mean, what did you think at the very beginning of this pandemic might happen to your family business?
Well, I suppose, Wendy, like so many other people in our position, you really didn't know. It was like standing on the edge of the precipice and about to jump without knowing where the bottom was, quite frankly. Quite different, actually, to previous, I would say, traditional recessions, if such an expression existed, where you could deal with a downturn in business in a way that you could still communicate and meet with people. This was particularly difficult because really meeting people was a complete no-no, and became difficult to communicate as effectively as you would need in the predicament we were in. So yes, I think probably all people could remember one of those JFK moments whenever we watched Boris on the TV, basically telling everybody to take their stuff and go home. And really unsure as to what was going to happen next, and quite a worrying time, because you just had no idea, was this going to last, as we thought, 2 months and we'd all be back again? No one really knew, and it was a case of having made a few preparations in advance of that and moving our teams to work from home. And then you went through a bit of a phase over the next month to 6 weeks of realising, actually, I can still communicate with all of my colleagues.
And Ian, that very much came out, I think, in the survey, didn't it? I could see you nodding there. I mean, it's not just what you do with your own business, but it's all of the people that you work with and your supply chains and so on that then feed into that whole problem.
Yeah, absolutely, Wendy. And as Paul said, it's been a unique challenge that COVID has brought, different to any other recessions. I mean, the survey unsurprisingly showed 83% of CEOs reported their business will be negatively impacted somehow by COVID. I think, though, to spin it slightly more positively, if I can, family firms, and particularly multi-generational family business, research shows that they tend to have an advantage in these situations. By the very fact that they've existed across generations, they've shown that they can overcome significant hurdles, both in terms of crisis and more planned hurdles as well, changing markets and demands and so on. Paul's absolutely right. Communication is probably one of the biggest challenges businesses have had to overcome. But from this, if I can pivot to the study, some family firms in the study reported surviving world wars, recessions, interest rate hikes. And in Northern Ireland, obviously, one company reported having survived regular bombings of their premises during the conflict. And that actually, and the ability to overcome those kind of challenges, built resilience into the family and the family business. And it meant that whenever we face the COVID challenges, family firms tend to be that bit more resilient and able to think more long term as well. And that's certainly some of the things that came out of the study.
Yes, and benevolent leadership now was one of the very first things that you mentioned, Darren. And I must say, I thought that was a fascinating nugget, almost right at the core of all of this. I mean, do you think that family businesses are more likely to have that? And to what degree did the study show just how important it was?
I think you're right, Wendy. I think that's one of the reasons, to my mind, having worked with family businesses over the last 20 or so years in practice, that they're so successful, because there is, and the study commented that there was an engagement with employees beyond the job title, if you like, or the job role, but there really was commitment. And I think benevolent leadership is one of the things that has employees so bought in. And at the same time, that's really good for customers as well, because they know that they're dealing with a solid organization with good values and good principles. So I think that's one of the reasons, on Ian's point, that family businesses are so successful. There's a real trust there within the team, and that's evident then to the customers.
Is that something, Paul, that you're aware of? I mean, in other circumstances, it might be if someone said, "Oh, this is terrific," you're a real star at benevolent leadership. It might be something that would make you blush. But was it something that was in your mind that you wanted to do this right for your employees and for your family as well?
Well, yeah, I mean, you really have to. I mean, at the core of our business, we across the group employ around 100 people in total. So you can imagine whenever something like this happens, that one of your first thoughts is, what happens to the guys that I work with? And some of those, I mean, we have a statistic that over 50% of the people who work with me have been with the company for more than 10 years. So these are like long-term friends. They're not just employees or colleagues, it's a lot more than that. And you do feel a real connection with the people that you work with, your colleagues that you're used working with day and daily. And the key thing for us was having regular update Teams chats with departments and colleagues. So every week there would have been timetabled what we would have called even welfare catch-ups, just to make sure that everybody was okay, because this was just uncharted waters that we were starting to run through.
That's very interesting that you say that, because communication is one of the elements that very much came out of the survey. So let's just take a deeper look at that if we could. I mean, how important is it, Ian, that an organisation is investing in communication, and what kind of impact can it have on organisational culture and indeed the long-term success of a business?
Yeah, one of the excuse me, one of the big findings from the survey, and again, unsurprisingly, just demonstrated how important clear and effective communication is for firms, particularly family firms too, Wendy, because of the unique nature of how family firms often communicate, making sure they get that right. And look, Paul know better than I do just how difficult the trade-offs with communication are, particularly when, as we've discussed, all of a sudden you can't see people face to face. I think from the employee perspective, clarity and candor over charisma is shown to be so important, in that I think quite often leaders can try and maybe grab for a nice soundbite or some grand communication gesture, but just as Paul's demonstrated, clear, consistent communication, not overwhelming people with information, because I think early on in the lockdown there was a temptation to over communicate somehow, and we can understand that inclination, but give people the information they need when they need it. And clear and simple and frequent communication is really important, because particularly in the early stages of the crisis, people had a limit the amount of information they could absorb. The focus on safety and health was really, really important in the early days, and then start to plan out and communicate over the longer term. And communication can be really important to develop resilience throughout this as well, from the health crisis as well as the economic crisis. Emphasizing the positivity where you find it too was shown through the survey to be vitally important as well.
And it's interesting that Paul referred to a lot of the communication with the people that he works with, which I thought was an interesting description as well, rather than that they worked for him. But the welfare aspect of it was, as you've both said, crucial. And the fact, Darren, that so many calls at that stage started off with "How are you?", which is absolutely not the way that most meetings would have started off, but before we all found ourselves sitting in the box room.
Yeah, and I think, Wendy, I was just thinking as Paul was speaking there, and we were talking about benevolent leadership. I mean, there's a man who was in the thick of it, and you can read all the business books you want and talk about all these, inspirational quotes, but at the end of the day, it's about talking to the people that you're working with. And as Ian said, being straight with them, because there was very limited information out there about where things were going to go. But the survey very strongly came across the importance of communicating honestly. And I think Paul for me just summarizes that, because he was there and that's what happened. One of the interesting things in the survey was that there was a 10-point margin on a difference between employees who were concerned about the future of the business and the future of the company compared to the CEOs, which just hammers home the importance of communication and those in senior roles being as clear as they can about the future. But it also shows you the confidence that leaders like Paul have in the future of those businesses.
I mean, it has been a huge challenge to leaders of all kinds of businesses, Ian, and maybe particularly family businesses, because when it's your own firm, you really care about it, and it not only supports you, but it by definition supports usually members of your family as well. What factors do you think contribute and have contributed to companies' coping strategy and resilience and ability to respond to change at this time?
Yeah, so if I can refer to an academic term in this, there's this idea of familyness, which is the essence of what makes a family business tick, which is really the unique bundle of resources that come because of the interaction between the family members that are involved in running the firm and the wider employees as well. And I think one of the useful things there, Wendy, is whenever we hit a crisis time, there is a kind of an all hands to the pump mentality, both in terms of the business itself, but then a kind of banding together to get it through, be it in the early stages of the crisis period, and then figuring out what this new normal will look like. Now, one of the beauties of being a family business in that is you extend what's called a stewardship climate. And that goes back to the idea of benevolent leadership, whereby non-family members actually start to identify themselves as being part of the wider family, even though they're not blood or not related. And indeed, even if they don't have an ownership stake in the firm, they see themselves as part of the family unit. And that kind of bridging element, so pulling in non-family employees who then can feel part of the family and become organizational citizens, can be a real source of strength to help figure out how to get over the initial hurdles, the initial humps, and indeed the longer term perspective going forward then, I think.
Familyness, I thought that was a fascinating part of the survey, actually. And one of the interesting subparts, if you like, of that familyness, Darren, was the fact that if you're in the family and you're in the family firm, or if you're married to someone who's in the family firm or whatever, how do you get away from it? And I thought it was very interesting that it dealt with that, about, getting out, doing things as an ordinary family, as opposed to those who were in the business, because we do all have to get our heads shard at some stage, don't we?
Yes, I think, Wendy, the Northern Ireland Family Business Forum over the years has done a lot of work around looking at kind of the business operating separate to a family constitution. So you've got two very separate things going on there. But perhaps one of the strengths during this lockdown period, in particular, that came out in the survey, is that families very often were perhaps in bubbles, were able to meet and work through issues where others may not have been during this crisis. So I think it's partly going back to the strength of family businesses, and even when they're not family, as Ian's saying. I mean, Paul's statistic of the average tenure of your employees at 10 years plus, that's great that you've got that loyalty in your team beyond the family.
And what about, Paul, then, the people, well, all of the people, I suppose, who work with a family business? You rely on the firm. I mean, both my grandfathers had family businesses. One was a heating, plumbing and electrical engineer, and he referred to his as the firm, and the other was a department store, which was just known as the shop. And in both circumstances, their families, that was their, well, it was, their lives, it was their income, it was their retirement, it was all of those things. Now, as it turned out, in both instances, it wasn't their retirement, because in both instances, unfortunately, they ceased to exist at a point. So you have all of that to worry about, and the people who are working with you are looking to you as well. I mean, how did you deal with the stresses that put on you, and what kind of advice would you give to others to deal with it, with the mental pressure that there's been over the last 12 months?
Yeah, and there certainly has been, and I think that mental pressure is not only for people like me in my position. That pressure's there right through our entire business. Everybody has concerns of their own, and they've all bills to pay, and it's symptomatic, actually, of the position where we are. I think the key for me was regular communication with everybody, keeping those channels open, mobile phones always on, talking to people right through the day, and just making sure, I suppose, that we kept everything, all the wheels oiled, ready to go. I think everybody here now, I mean, we still, I suppose technically it is still a family business, because it's a second generation after my dad started it back in 72. But I see the family is now a wider family, as Darren and Ian both mentioned. And I think I look at a number of my colleagues who have worked with some of them now up to 30 and 35 years, that they're effectively like an extended family now. And so that's the way we approach it. And I always try and instill that we're all in this together. This isn't just a case of delegating or talking down or getting other people to do things. I always work on the basis that you only ask people to do what you're able to do yourself, and try and share the experience, good or bad, if you're in it with people. and you're able to go to battle alongside somebody, I think you usually find that everybody understands a lot more, and they can cope with it a little bit better, knowing that we're all in this together.
Let's look ahead now and kind of lift our eyes to the horizon, which hopefully has a light on it at the end of the tunnel, to completely mix my metaphors. But it's worth noting that 98.1% of CEOs reported that the pandemic will change their business model going forward. So can a crisis be the best time to create deep change for the future? I mean, I noted that some who responded to the survey talked about it being a once in a lifetime opportunity to execute deep change in the organisation. Is that a good thing, Ian?
Yeah, absolutely. If there is a positive to take from the pandemic, it's forced a lot of businesses, both family and non, to have a hard look at how they operate, from operating costs through to their business model and how they do business. And we've seen through the survey and other examples of opportunities that have arisen in it, be it innovation opportunities, pivoting to new markets, and perhaps areas of the business that weren't core before actually now becoming core, because they might have only been the only part of the business allowed to continue to operate as quote unquote normal, relatively speaking. So if anything, crisis, because crisis is such an upsetting time generally, both in terms of our work patterns and our personal patterns. So whenever we're in a period of crisis, it is an opportunity, not in the short term, but certainly more in the medium term, and then beginning to come out of the longer term going, how do we want to learn positive lessons from how we've been operating and start to embed those going forward? And it can be tricky because so much of the early days was spent all hands to the pump, frontline firefighting, but that we need to make sure that doesn't compromise then the long-term orientation and long-term planning in the business.
Darren?
Yes, I mean, I would echo Ian's comments. It is an opportunity to step back from an accounting point of view. It's an opportunity to review things that perhaps weren't profitable and focus on more profitable lines. And also from our own practices point of view, we have a team of 50 here across a couple of floors in Belfast. And, I stand back and think, what are we going to do about getting more people back in here? And I do, just to get on a hobby horse of mine, I do see that we would have a much greater return in terms of staff, because personal interaction, this is no substitute for it. Although it's brilliant, it's no substitute for working together face to face. And I'm sure Paul would see that in terms of his business sector and supplying into businesses like ours.
Well, that's very much been the case with you, Paul, hasn't it? That tell us a bit about how you've been addressing those challenges for your customers.
I think the difficulty comes for a lot of people when they try to get too many people back all at one time, and there's a bit of a culture shock. And what we've tried to advise any of the clients that we're working with is to do as we did back last May, where literally in May, 6 people came back and occupied certain parts of the building. We introduced a one-way system around our building, so people didn't come into face-to-face contact, and a number of different procedures about areas where people would generally congregate. So as time moves on and more people are getting vaccinated, and as I describe, you hear people talking about the post-COVID world and what that'll look like. And I often refer to it as the post-vaccine world, because I think that's where the impact's going to really come home, is once the percentages go really high with everybody vaccinated and there's a degree more control.
And how do you balance, Ian, between the aspects of future planning, the long-term strategic vision of your business, which has seemed like it's maybe a long way away over the last few months, when it has been a kind of firefighting operation, dealing with the day-to-day challenges. How do you strike that balance? Maybe take the time to look that bit further ahead.
Yeah, it's certainly difficult, Wendy, and it's very context dependent as well. We have to recognize some businesses have been, given the nature of their business, maybe their their key and core businesses in the supply chain. They have been, while disrupted, but their operating practices have remained relatively normal, perhaps. And then other businesses have been from top to bottom disrupted. So it's very context dependent. I do think then the quicker you can start to get a handle on, and again, we're still in a very fluid situation as the healthcare advice evolves, the quicker you can start to get a handle with planning, even in the medium term, if not the longer term, that's important too, because you need to get a sense and a handle of where your business is at come the other side of this. And Paul's absolutely right. I think a post-vaccination world is what we're starting to think about and starting to look to. Going back to what we said earlier, the communication piece, consult, and then be decisive, and be decisive with confidence. It's hard to be confident, if I can say, given sometimes the void of information and the lack of clarity from other areas. But in terms of yourself, your own family, and your own family firm, we need leaders that are decisive and confident with that decisiveness as far as practically possible, and then always be ready to change and adapt given how the situation evolves as well, I think.
And that leadership point's an interesting one too, Darren. When Paul was saying that his family firm is currently second generation, I know that you deal with family firms where there are many more generations than that involved. And quite often it can be that those new ideas or elements of the skill set that's going to be needed in future, but which was less relevant 13 months ago, they may well come from the next generation, mightn't they? Developing those strategic responses and maybe listening to the younger members of the family.
That's right. I think we've seen examples of that in our practice here. Perhaps the embracing technology such as this, which we all would have been reluctant to do 12 months ago, is now second nature. And in multi-generational family businesses where there are younger people coming through, they've maybe got an opportunity to really step into their own, depending on the business sector. But so yes, I think there is perhaps an opportunity in all of this for the younger people coming through with perhaps different ideas.
And also, you mentioned it earlier on, the fact that different families deal with their family businesses in different ways. They maybe have a constitution or some other thing which guides them through what can be a very tricky time. It's not all happy families around the kitchen table, is it?
No, that's correct. These are incredibly tough times, but I'd turn that around again and say, look, on your question of the longer term strategic planning, a family constitution, the very principles and values in which family businesses are founded are a real go-to source, a rock, if you like, on which short and long-term decisions can be taken, particularly when there's limited information. I think that kind of bedrock of the family and some sort of constitution of how they will deal with things really helps.
And it's interesting to, through these weird months that we've had, the numbers of companies that I've been speaking to during that time who have actually been hiring people. With John Healy on the last podcast, they've taken on 200 people during the last year, none of whom has ever walked across the doorstep of Allstate. It seems like such a weird concept. Is that something that you've looked at, Paul? It's not always that the necessary skill set is readily available in-house. So, have you been looking beyond the doorstep once you did open that front door, undo the lock and get back in again?
For us, from my personal experience is that whenever the job retention scheme kicked in, thankfully, and we were forced to furlough numbers of members of staff, because there was an immediate downturn. The last thing people wanted to do last March and April was start furnishing their offices whenever they were told they weren't supposed to be there. So that had an immediate negative impact on the run of the business. We furloughed quite a number of people and took advantage of that scheme, worked it as best we could. And then whenever on the 1st of July last year, whenever there was a degree more flexibility came into the scheme, that allowed you to bring people back for a few days and then furlough for a few days. That allowed us to start bringing more of the team back. And fortunately now, we're now back to full tilt. So it actually feels as though we have recruited people when in fact we haven't recruited anybody per se. But what we've done is we've managed the numbers working through the business flexibly as the volume of business begins to increase again. And I guess we were lucky as well that because we cover not just Northern Ireland, but Republic and Scotland and England, that there's quite a wide geography, and there were a number of contracts in place at the time that we had to deliver through last year that actually, if you like, probably safeguarded the performance of the business through that time. And it meant that we had ongoing revenue generation in that time. And I think now it's definitely the clamour and what I hear 90% of the people that you hear now talking is, they just want to get back. They want degrees of normality, people's well-being and mental well-being, being stuck in the house for long periods of time. Just, what I suppose the one key adjustment for me, if I look back 2 years ago, and this is a personal reflection for myself, I could never have seen a time whenever I would have been comfortable with people working with me, working from home. I just was alien to my thinking. And I think now, sitting here today, that's something that's probably going to be pretty much here to stay in some shape or form.
Yeah, and support, information, all of that. I mean, that's all been crucial through all of this as well. Whether it's in the staff that you have, the way that you're running your business or whatever. But what role, Ian, does the university play in ensuring access to that best support and information?
Yeah, and one of the best pieces of advice we always give is seek help where you need it, and don't be afraid to admit the blind spots that you have, and particularly whenever adapting to and pivoting to a new way of working. And the Ulster University and the Business School in particular is here to just do that, offer help and support to business, whether on a one-to-one, ad hoc or more long-term basis. I mean, there are a range of support initiatives available through the advice that we give in terms of best practice and research. And I should also highlight the work of the Northern Ireland Family Business Forum. Now, our activity in the forum has been curtailed somewhat naturally with the pandemic, but the work we do in bringing family firms together and learning lessons from each other, whether it's facing challenges of succession and so on, that will continue. From the business school itself, the opportunities that things like knowledge transfer partnerships offer and innovation vouchers offer to work with experts in particular fields in enabling change and putting plans in place to improve, whether it's a business process or business scalability, is there right the way through as well to like student placements, internships, and then learning and capacity for yourself and your own team right throughout the business in terms of more formal training courses and education courses right across the board. So our advice is, if there's anything we can help with, we're here and we're ready. And we have had some great stories of successful collaborations with businesses throughout the past year, and that will only continue, hopefully.
Let's hope so indeed. Let's wrap up on a practical level, if we could. What investments or actions can firms take now to sustain their business and position it to thrive in a post-pandemic landscape? Darren, what would you say to that?
I think the first thing I would say, Wendy, is if you're running a small business of any size or family business, and you're still operating, you've still got your head above water after the last 12 months, step back. It is a huge achievement to be sitting where you are at this moment in time. So don't overlook that. This is a once in a lifetime situation that we've come through. And what I would say is step back and consider what as Simon Sinek would have said, it says, look, what's the why of the business? What are your founding values and principles? Because that will help you make decisions in the light of very limited information. And the third thing would be just to echo Ian's comments, to reach out to your peers and to your networks and to other support that's available to help you take decisions as we head into what is still a very uncertain time.
Ian, what would your answer to that be on a practical level, investments or actions that firms can take?
Yeah, I think two things. Firstly, picking up from what Paul is saying, learn what's worked for you throughout this and what's brought your people along with you and consolidate that. And then as you return to something approaching a new or different normal, build on that and communicate that well. I think the biggest piece of advice I would have is investment should be from a family business perspective. Yes, you spend a lot of time in the family business. For leaders, make sure you're investing in yourself and your family, because if you don't have a handle on your own well-being and your family's well-being and mental health, then it's going to be really difficult to lead. And let me be clear, we need strong, effective and decisive leaders at the helm of our firms going forward, because that's what our recovery and growth is going to be predicated on. So take time for yourself and make sure whatever you need to do to check in with yourself that you're doing that.
There's the order for you, Paul. Take a break.
Yep.
Apart from that, though, what investments or actions, what are you planning to do to make sure that your business sustains and is going to thrive in the coming months and years?
Well, I think for us to thrive, we'll rely on a strong client bank throughout the country. I think what I would say to anybody, which we're doing ourselves, so it's, again, empathizing with others, I would say to people to embrace the change. Don't fight against it, because there's no point in pretending that the old ways pre the pandemic, you can just flick a switch and it all just goes straight back to that. At Alpha 1080, our business, what we do is we assist clients to repurpose the space that they have, and some of those customers, they describe creating destinations for their staff to come back to. And that's very much what I would say to people is, like, create the environment that your people are going to be comfortable coming back to. They're going to feel safe, welcomed, part of the team, get them involved, explain in advance what you're trying to do. Don't leave it until they're already in and then you're trying to cope with maybe a degree of panic. I'm very confident, like the other guys on the call. I think the future here has got a lot of things going for it. It is going to be different. There's no doubt about it. It is going to be different, but I think different, it can be good. And the one thing that's guaranteed that we know is there's always going to be change.
Well, by the sound of things, you've been dealing with it pretty well, Paul, I think, and you're a great example of why family firms do make up the backbone of our small and medium enterprises here in Northern Ireland. It's been fascinating talking to all three of you, I must say. Really, really interesting. If you've been listening to and watching this podcast and want to know more, it's really worth reading that report. Actually, I think it's got some terrific lessons in there, not just for family businesses, but for many businesses in the way that they carry out their operations. Darren, Ian, Paul, thanks all of you very much for joining me. This has been a Business of Possibility podcast with Ulster University Business School. You can get it where you normally get your podcasts, and leave us a rating if you can, that'd be good. And there'll be another one soon. Thanks for joining us.